Welcome to the Ducks Unlimited podcast, the only podcast about all things waterfowl. From hunting insights to science-based discussions about ducks, geese, and issues affecting waterfowl and wetlands conservation in North America, we bring the resource to you. The DU Podcast with your host, Dr. Mike Brazier.
When we discuss migratory birds on this podcast, most times those discussions are going to focus on waterfowl, ducks, geese, or swans. But occasionally, we're going to have an opportunity to broaden those discussions to include species beyond waterfowl. And this is one of those occasions because today we're going to be sharing information on Sandhill Cranes with a particular emphasis on the eastern population of Sandhill Cranes. Sandhill Cranes are a logical extension of some of our earlier conversations because these birds use many of the same habitats as do waterfowl. They are the beneficiaries of much of the conservation work that we do for waterfowl. And waterfowl hunters and bird watchers often intersect with these birds while out pursuing waterfowl in some form or fashion. Also, I can attest from personal experience that Sandhill Cranes are excellent table fare, just like many of our waterfowl species. So I'm pretty excited about this episode, and I hope you are as well. Joining me to discuss this exciting group of birds is someone who knows a great deal about Sandhill Cranes in eastern North America, and that is Dr. John Brunges, Migratory Bird Program Coordinator for Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife Resources. John, welcome to the podcast, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's a great first experience to be here with you.
John, we want to start out giving you the same opportunity we do all of our guests, and that is to provide our listeners with a brief background of a brief description of your personal and professional background and where it is you are right now and what you do for the department.
Sounds great. I am one of those kids that grew up fascinated with outdoors and wildlife, and I've told many folks that I am probably the result of a Ducks Unlimited Greenwing event. Somewhere way back in the 1970s, as a little kid, I went to a DU Greenwing event and became obsessed with ducks and went through my life kind of as a series of adventures chasing ducks, and couldn't give it up and went to graduate school, and continued to pursue wildlife and wildlife conservation, and ended up eventually here in Kentucky. But I went to my undergraduate in North Carolina at a small school called the University of North Carolina at Wilmington, where I was basically a marine biology and biology major, studied seabirds while I was there, then moved on to the University of Georgia for my master's, and then finally Texas Tech for my PhD. And then through that route, I've worked in a number of different places, but eventually ended up here as the Migratory Bird Program Coordinator in Kentucky, which means I kind of oversee our migratory game bird programs, ducks, geese, Sandhill Cranes, and mourning doves, and other things that people like to hunt, as well as some of the non-game species that are tied to wetlands here in Kentucky. So I love it. It's been a lifelong passion, and I'm glad to be able to keep doing it.
How long have you been there with Kentucky Department of Wildlife? What is it? I'm going to have to get this right here because they're all different.
The Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife Resources. We're right about 15 years that I've been here in Kentucky. I came here from Texas, and I had the opportunity to start out working actually with a little while on non-game birds here in Kentucky, and then switched and worked for Rocky Pritchard, who was our previous coordinator, and worked mostly with webless species, including cranes, doves, and now I kind of oversee all the program.
Well, it's a delight to have you on. You and I have known one another for a number of years, and whenever I learned that you were actively involved in working on the Mississippi Flyways Sandhill Crane plan of some sort, you're going to tell me more about that here in a minute in terms of exactly what you're doing. But basically, I learned that you were neck deep in researching what's going on with Sandhill Cranes in the eastern U.S. And I said, that's a great topic. That's somebody that I need to get on to discuss that, because Sandhill Cranes are incredibly fascinating. I mean, they're gaining greater appreciation by a host of people. Certainly the hunting community is seeing what's happening with this bird, the growth of their populations. They are a wonderful resource. They are outstanding table fare. And so this is, again, I'm really excited about this. I think cranes are a tremendous success story, certainly in the eastern U.S., and we're excited to bring this story to our listeners and excited to have you be part of it. So Let's kind of jump in here, John. Fill me in on exactly what it is you're working on. We're going to get into a lot of the details on Sandhill Cranes later on, but just sort of at a very high level, what is it? What have you been working on with regard to Sandhill Cranes here for the Mississippi Flyway? Is it like a management plan of some sorts?
It is a management plan, and for any species that we have hunting seasons for, it's very important to monitor those populations carefully and make sure that hunting is not having detrimental effects. And so, in the U.S., there are a number of different populations of migratory sandhill cranes. And in Kentucky, the population that comes through Kentucky is called the eastern population of sandhill cranes. And they basically nest around the Great Lakes region of North America and then winter somewhere between Indiana and Florida. And so that they make that migration every year. And so that population was really, really impacted by, prior to the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, by lack of hunting regulations and things. And there were basically almost no birds left in this population. And with the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, in 1918, we have seen a population that is slowly but steadily recovered to the point in 2010 where the Mississippi Flyway and the Atlantic Flyway got together and wrote a management plan that would allow for a small regulated hunting season on sandhill cranes. And so that, unfortunately, 2010 seemed like yesterday, but it's 10 years old now. And we've learned a lot of things in those 10 years. And so it's time to revise the plan. It was probably time a couple of years ago, and things get busy and it hasn't gotten done, but it's on the front burner now, and it's got to get done.
Well, and that means that you've been, a lot of your time here recently has been focused on this particular species. And so I wanted to have you on to discuss it. So let's back up and talk pretty basic stuff about sandhill cranes as a species. In the eastern U.S., as you kind of described, there's still fairly restricted distribution. You get into the central flyway, and certainly if you've made any trips to Saskatchewan or Manitoba during certain times of the year, you're likely to have encountered these birds. But in the eastern U.S., there's still some fairly restricted distributions. So there may be some listeners that aren't too familiar with what these things are. So tell us. I always find this fascinating, John, that the taxonomy of this species, they look an awful lot like herons, the great blue heron, the great egret, those kind of long-legged wading birds. They look real similar to cranes, sandhill cranes and whooping cranes are the two cranes that we have in North America. But those birds, cranes and herons, are not even in the same taxonomic order. So for those that might be taxonomy buffs in the crowd, tell our folks about cranes and how they kind of fall out in that taxonomic classification.
They really are very, very different birds. They're probably much more closely related to rails than they would be to other wading birds. I can tell you a call I get all the time is, I got a crane in my pond. It's standing on the side of the pond. Well, it's not going to be a crane, likely. It's going to be a great blue heron. And the sandhills are probably the most abundant crane species in the world here. So they are commonly confused with our wading birds, such as great blue herons or other herons. But if you watch them, you can tell really quickly. The cranes fly with their neck extended. Herons also fly with their neck kind of in S-shaped fashion, and how they behave. And, herons are mostly fish eaters and are fishing and catching things like that, where cranes are more of a grain feeder or things like that in uplands. If you see a bird out in the middle of a field, it's going to be a crane, not a heron. So some of those are the differences and how they, some of their strategies and how they nest. Cranes are solitary nesters versus most of your wading birds are colonial nesters, and they nest in big groups. And cranes nest on the ground or on humps out in the marsh, where herons and egrets are often up in the top of a tree somewhere. So they look similar, but they're definitely different critters.
Cranes are actually more closely related to coots than they are the herons and the egrets, and that For people that are familiar with waterfowl, you've seen coots. You've probably seen a few rails as well. Coots are in the rail family. But yeah, it's pretty striking to tell someone that sandhill crane is more closely related to the coot than it is to the great blue heron. But a little bit of trivia there for you.
They're neat birds.
So, John, let's back up here and talk about distribution a bit of sandhill cranes in North America. You've referenced already that there are different populations of sandhill cranes. So tell our listeners about those. How many are there, and where are they found?
In the U.S., in North America, I should say, we recognize 6 migratory populations of sandhill cranes. And so those 6 would include the eastern population that I kind of previously mentioned, the Central Valley jumping west, the Central Valley population, which would occur in California, Washington, Oregon. You have a lower Colorado River Valley population, which is mostly Arizona and California, and then Rocky Mountain population, which is up in the fall of the Rocky Mountains in the winter down in New Mexico into Mexico. And then the real biggie is the mid-continent population, which is over last year's survey was over 1 million birds in that population. And they nest across Canada and Alaska, and with a sizable group coming from Siberia. And they will come down and winter in Central Flyway, kind of down mostly in Texas, but Oklahoma, and then into Mexico as well. So the mid-continent birds they basically stretch across the northern parts of Canada and then end up and into Alaska and then Siberia and then come down south from there. So it's interesting. When we were in Texas, there was a student from Japan that put a satellite transmitter on a crane in Siberia, and he was there following it around the Texas Panhandle. So pretty cool to think those birds actually migrate across the Bering Sea there and then come down into North America.
Yeah, with all this new technology, we're getting more and more of those stories of these fascinating feats that migratory birds are able to accomplish. It's just amazing, and it's what makes them real special to study and to help conserve habitat on their behalf, for sure. So, John, I grew up in Mississippi, and I know there is a population of sandhill cranes in South Mississippi, but that's not one that you mentioned. I also know there's a resident flock in Florida. So talk about those two as well, the resident populations in Florida and Mississippi.
There are 3 non-migratory populations of sandhills. And again, the Mississippi population, which is a tiny population. The last number that I could dig up is somewhere around 100 birds in that population. Very, very few left. And then a slightly bigger population is found in Florida and into South Georgia, called the Florida population. If you've ever been to Disney World or that part of the world and seen sandhill cranes walking down the side of the road, that is that Florida population bird. And then lastly, and there's somewhere around 4,000 or 5,000 in that population. And then lastly, there's a Cuban population, which has about 600 sandhill cranes that occur across parts of Cuba. So we have three non-migratory groups as well as the migratory. And as you said, the Mississippi population is extremely endangered and really only occurs on that one Mississippi Sandhill Crane National Wildlife Refuge. So they are one that we keep very, very careful watch on.
There's a number of things that we could discuss with respect to each of these populations. Certainly the populations out in the western U.S., the mid-continent, as you mentioned, is the largest, and there are a host of studies that have been conducted over the years. There's a host of data with respect to harvest and all sorts of things related to those. That's not going to be the focus of our eventual conversation here. We'd probably get somebody like Dr. Jim Dubofsky on the podcast if we wanted to discuss some of those populations, or Dr. Dan Collins. I know he's been involved in some of those in the southwestern U.S. So there's a lot of study going on out there as well. But the eastern population is pretty interesting in itself, and we're going to eventually get to that discussion, what's happened with it. But let's continue on with our discussion about sort of basic life history of of cranes, Sandhill cranes. We've talked about the historical distribution, these different populations. Now, preferred habitats. You referenced this already, John, but just again, what are we talking about? Where are people most likely to find Sandhill cranes?
It depends on what time of year you're talking about. But if you're talking about in the breeding distribution, they nest in wetlands. They nest generally in areas, wetland marsh type areas, where they can find a hump out in the marsh and build up a hump that gets them up above the water surface level, but provides protection from predators. And so those spots are where they nest, and then they'll come out of those areas. They'll feed around in the wetlands, but then they also come out and feed in agricultural fields. But as the winter goes, as the fall goes on and they leave their nesting sites, and they switch to more and more use of agricultural type fields, harvested agricultural fields, and will use basically wetland areas for their roosting spots at night. One of the challenges for us in Kentucky is, places where cranes can roost at night safely. They got to have somewhere where the water's shallow enough that they can stand and see what's going on, so that predators can't get them. They don't roost in trees like so many other birds, so they have to have shallow water areas where they can see what's going on around them.
That brings back memories of some of the roost ponds that I've seen in Saskatchewan. They're just these vast, expansive, very shallow wetlands that have some sparse emergent vegetation in them, exactly as you described there. And so it's a pretty neat little situation. That's also one of the reasons why those Sandhill cranes are some of the early migrants out of those staging areas in southern Saskatchewan. They once you start to get some of those freezing temperatures, those shallow roost ponds, roost wetlands begin to freeze up. They're gone. So that's also just another little interesting fact of how their habitat associations kind of affect some of the timing of their migration. So Sandhill cranes are also, at least in some cases, they can be problematic with regard to crop depredation. Do I have that right, John?
You do, and there are in areas like Wisconsin and Michigan and maybe Minnesota, some of our Great Lakes states, and certainly in Ontario as well. There are cases where the young corn, when it's planted, Sandhill cranes will go in and pull it up, just as it's emerging, and eat. Will actually do pretty substantial damage to crop fields. There's been some research done in recent years with some taste diversion stuff that you can put on corn, so that cranes will, when they start to go pull it up, it tastes bad, and they've had real success with keeping crane predation down on cornfields down by putting this taste diversion thing on the seeds.
So let's move on now to a bit more of their ecology. The Sandhill cranes are a large bird. Generally speaking, larger birds, larger animals have a longer lifespan. What do we know about the age at first breeding? What do we know about their breeding system? And what do we know about kind of longevity of Sandhill cranes?
Well, they are, as you said, long-lived, and most of their breeding strategy revolves around that. But in general, it's wildlife and anything can happen. But in general, we're talking that a 4 or 5 year old is the first time that they actually breed. And they are, people say that they mate for life, that they basically form pair bonds that last over a long time. And that is the case. Although I heard one biologist describe them as they're conveniently monogamous. Basically, as long as they like the other member, it works out. But if it doesn't, then they can replace that mate and find them another one. So they're kind of like people, I guess, in that case. I guess we're conveniently monogamous when we want to be. So but in theory, they mate for life. If one member of the pair is lost, they will replace that member. So it's not like they stop breeding forever after that. And so, but the longevity still a little bit unknown. But I'll tell you a story. A lady called me here about a year ago, and she had shot a banded sandhill crane during our hunting season, and which made me nervous because there's so few banded cranes out there, and there are a whole lot of banded whooping cranes. But it was a sandhill, and it was the basically in January of 2018, and it was banded as an adult in 1983 in the UP of Michigan.
Oh my goodness, was that 35 years?
Yes. So, that was and I was like, how was it eating? She's like, the best thing I ever had. So 35-year-old bird was still tasty. So,
wow.
But I'd say 20 plus years is probably a realistic expectation with these birds. And at least in this one case, we had one that we knew was over 35 years old.
Yeah, and that's pretty remarkable. And there's an intersection there between its life history and kind of harvest management. But these birds that don't reach sexual maturity, don't breed until 45 years of age, you kind of have to be a bit more cautious in some respects with harvest strategies, because you don't want to shoot all these birds before they have an opportunity to get to breeding. And you're obviously way more knowledgeable of all this than I am. We'll get to that a bit later on, but just to kind of plant that seed for people to be thinking about how the age at first breeding is really important in terms of how we think about harvest management.
They're not mallards. We don't manage them the same way, for sure.
That's right. That's a great point. So, John, let's pivot here and start talking about the eastern population of sandhill cranes. As I mentioned, we could talk about what all is going on in the mid-continent and farther out west if we wanted to, but let's just try to center our discussion on what's happening in the east. That's where you've been working, what you've been studying, so that seems appropriate. And you introduced sort of the historical decline of the eastern population of sandhill cranes. And so let's talk a bit more about that. They were hunted almost to extinction, but what do we know about the lowest levels, population levels of sandhill cranes in the eastern U.S.? What was their historical range? Let's just kind of start with those two things.
Well, unfortunately, like many things prior to 1900, it's awfully hard to get a grasp on what their historical range was and what exactly was going on. But all accounts that you can find, the number of eastern population sandhill cranes there were less than 100 birds left. They were just a very, very small group. I've heard folks say down as small as 20, but let's just say less than 100 birds. And so with the protection provided by the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, that population has slowly started to come back. And as you talked about, they don't breed till they're 4 or 5 years old. In most cases, they lay a couple of eggs and maybe have one successful colt, which is what they would call a young crane. So they're not a fast reproducer. So over time, it's taken years and years and years for that population to grow. And so we finally started in the 70s, started seeing an appreciable population in this group, and it slowly started to tick up since then till 2010, when we considered, okay, is this population big enough? And at 2010, we were talking about populations where the 3-year average was 30-ish thousand birds. So we do a fall count and count those birds. And so at that point, we came up with the plan, and the population has continued to grow. We've gotten better at counting them. And nowadays, the last couple of years, the average of that population is over 80,000 birds. So we're growing, and it's continuing to do well. And I think we're getting to a point where the population's grown so much, our survey doesn't capture the population anymore. That all the areas where we count, they filled those up, and now they've spread out to other spots, and we're counting the same number each year. But yet the population is continuing to grow, and we're just missing a bigger and bigger part while we count them.
I'm going to ask you more details about those surveys later on, but right now I want to kind of stick with the population distribution on this species. But I can't let this go without just acknowledging that sandhill cranes have become the latest in a line of conservation success stories. We can begin to put those in the same category as wood ducks and wild turkeys, white-tailed deer, Canada geese. It's just amazing. The more we start to understand about these species, the better able we are to actually implement strategies that will help these birds recover. And so this, again, one of those remarkable success stories.
And it really, think from just a few, less than 100 birds to more than certainly probably more than 100,000 in the population now. It is really exciting. And there are so many people here in Kentucky that tell me, man, I never saw a sandhill crane until 10 years ago. And now we see them every year and they come through. And so it's, around here, the migration kind of starts around the opening day of gun season. So everybody in the woods, sitting in the woods, deer hunting, listens to those birds coming over, and they're a spectacular thing. So it's a neat thing.
Is there any indication, John, that this population growth is starting to level off, or are we still seeing it increase at a pretty good clip?
I believe we're still seeing an increase. There has been some research done. The International Crane Foundation has had a long-term study looking at breeding success of Sandhill Cranes in Wisconsin, and their research has shown that in recent years, basically the reproduction of the cranes in Wisconsin has really, really dropped down to nearly zero. And you think about our back to population biology days where we learned about populations. They start out low, they grow, they produce a lot of young, and when they reach carrying capacity, that reproductive effort falls way down. And so basically now the birds have to spend so much time defending territories and things like that they are not very successful. But the population doesn't need them to be successful in those areas. But so their reproduction in some of those parts of Wisconsin looked really low. But if you look at what we see in Kentucky, and Dave Franczak, who's a biologist with the Fish and Wildlife Service, also looked at birds in Indiana, we're still seeing 10, 11, 12% of the birds coming through are young birds every year. And that's the sign of a still rapidly growing population. So every year we're adding, 10,000 or more birds to the population. So it is still at this point, at least from looking at the young birds coming, not everywhere has reached that carrying capacity. And we certainly see, in the past 10, 15 years ago, we were talking about birds breeding in Wisconsin and Michigan and just a small area around the Great Lakes. And now they're expanding well into Ontario and Quebec and all the way over to New York and Ohio. And so many places where they didn't used to occur, or at least haven't in recent years occurred. That map, even 10 years after we did the management plan in 2010, is going to look dramatically different in 2020.
Wow, it's exciting to hear about that expansion and that growth. John, you mentioned that during the surveys, you were able to identify young birds and adult birds. For those that may not know, how do you differentiate young birds from adults from a distance? There's a couple ways. Number one, their voice is very distinct. You can hear I don't make sounds, so I apologize for that. But my brother is a concert violinist and conductor, and I can't blow a duck call. So, I try not to make any sounds. But they have a distinct sound. But more than that, the adult birds are a nice gray. They have that red cap. They have it's just the young birds are much dirtier looking and much less. Have the colors and nearly as nice as the adults do. So they're pretty distinct when you get the chance to look at them. They're just missing some of those real distinct colors that the adults have. You mentioned the distribution of birds and the breeding distributions. Let's talk a bit more about their breeding habitats. What type of wetlands are they going to be breeding in or nesting in, I should say, and then what do we know about their diet during the breeding season?
Freshwater marshes, or your the typical Great Lakes freshwater marshes, emergent marshes, where again what they need is little islands out in the marsh that they can build up a hump to build, for them a place to get the eggs out of the water and be able to to protect and watch their nest. And the female does most of the incubating, but the male is right there and involved in nest defense and things like that. But they eat during that time period. Like most birds, they are mostly a vegetarian, but during times of nesting, they, like many birds, will switch to invertebrates, insects and things like that, or small mammals or fish or anything like that to provide extra protein and things for their young as they start raising their young. So there's reports of them eating everything from small mammals to fish and that. But, in general, they would be more likely to be a vegetarian than a meat eater.
Yeah, but it sounds like they're not terribly discriminatory when it comes to what they eat, certainly in the breeding season. And then during during migration in winter, that's when they're certainly not shy about taking advantage of the grains that are on the landscape, right?
Absolutely. You find, when you get here in Kentucky and other places, they will roost on a lake, and then they all morning they head out and lions headed to those harvested ag fields, corn or milo or whatever else that might be out there that they can pick up seeds in.
John, from a historical conservation standpoint, we think about some of these other success stories, wood ducks. We've got the nest box that played a key role. We've got wild turkeys where reintroductions played a key role, and Canada geese as well. Was reintroduction or were any other kind of targeted habitat management efforts? You mentioned islands, so I kind of find myself wondering if there were targeted efforts to create wetlands that had a bunch of islands in them. Were there any of these? What kind of efforts were involved in the conservation and growth of the eastern population?
It mostly occurred. I think it mostly occurred just through protection of wetlands in general. There are not many specific examples out there of, hey, we built, with ducks, we build wetlands for ducks for this particular thing. We do this. And I think in general, just protection of wetlands that allows this. I've never read a story about somebody going out and building islands for them. And I call it an island. I mean, they may use vegetation to build a hump out there in the marsh. And so I think this is one of those cases is more about protection than really hardcore management, that we did something like trapping and stocking and things like that we just left them alone enough to allow them to do their thing. And again, the protection of wetlands, through DU and everything, how many wetlands we've lost in this country and in North America in general. And through whatever kind of different processes that have protected wetlands over the years, that has certainly resulted in helping the cranes. But it's been more about just leaving them alone and allowing them to do their thing than really hardcore active management. Say something like the whooping crane, where we've had such a hands-on approach to them.
That's pretty fascinating. I don't think I realized that the strong dichotomy there between the successes between these examples. You think trumpeter swans also is an example where we've done some reintroductions, and certainly the whooping cranes as well. But it's pretty interesting to learn that the Sandhill crane, we figured out that, hey, we can't harvest these things the way we've been doing, unregulated, and then we just kind of let them go and try to preserve their important wetlands, and they did the rest. That's pretty fascinating to learn that.
In North America, we basically stopped hunting cranes from 1918 to 1960, and then after that, 61 on, we've slowly increased hunting opportunity in the nation. But in this eastern population, 2011 was the first year that they were hunted since almost 100 years that they had been protected from hunting and things. But it's more about just allowing them to in their nesting areas to make sure they've got those wetlands that are there and just letting them do their thing.
John, this is probably a perfect place to leave this episode, to bring this episode to a close, because we're about to get into a discussion on hunting opportunities for eastern sandhill cranes. And I have a number of questions for you in that regard, because you don't just flip a switch and say, okay, we're going to start harvesting this bird. There's a lot of work that goes into that. You mentioned early on that our harvest is regulated. It's science-based. So there's a lot of steps that have to be taken. And I want to hear about some of those. And then we're going to talk about the harvest opportunities that are in place in the eastern U.S. So with that, John, I want to thank you for joining us here on this episode, sharing some of this great information on sandhill cranes from a fairly basic standpoint at this point. But we're going to get into some more details on the harvest of these birds. So, John, thanks for joining us.
Hey, thanks so much for having me. I enjoyed it very much.
A special thanks to our guest on today's episode, Dr. John Brunjes. Migratory Bird Program Coordinator for Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife Resources. We appreciate his insights on Sandhill Cranes all across North America. As always, we thank our producer, Clay Baird, who does the editing of this show and does the publishing of these episodes as well. He always does a great job in everything he does. And to you, the listener, we thank you for your time and interest in this podcast. We thank you for supporting the podcast, and we thank you for your commitment to wetlands and waterfowl conservation.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the DU Podcast. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the show, and visit www.ducks.org/DU Podcast for resources based on today's topics, as well as access to more episodes. Opinions expressed by guests do not necessarily reflect those of Ducks Unlimited. Until next time, stay tuned to the Ducks.